We begin Maseches Megillah, which is going to focus primarily on the laws of Kriyas Megillah and the other halachos of Purim, but we're going to see there are going to be two pockets of Mishnayos in the Masechta that are going to digress greatly from the halachos of Megillah and the halachos of Purim. The first din in the Masechta is going to discuss the time when one could read Megillas Esther. Technically speaking, we're going to see that there are 2 days that one reads Megillas Esther, certain cities on the 14th of Adar, and certain cities on the 15th of Adar. However, one could read the Megillah under certain circumstances as early as the 11th of Adar, and any day in between the 11th and the 15th. So in other words, it's a situation that certain people can read the Megillah on the 11th, the 12th, the 13th, the 14th, and the 15th of Adar. And that's what the Mishnah begins first by setting up a rule, and then telling us the rules for deciding how. Megillah Nikres, the Megillah is read Ba'achad Asar on the 11th, B'Shneim Asar on the 12th, B'Shlosha Asar on the 13th, B'Arba Asar on the 14th, B'Chamisha Asar on the 15th of Adar, Lo Pachos, never before, less than the 11th day of Adar, V'Lo Yosar, and never after, more than the 15th day of Adar. So the Mishnah begins by telling us the basic halacha. Karachim, large cities, Hamukafin Choma, which are surrounded by a wall, Mimos Yoshua ben Nun. From the time of Yoshua ben Nun, Korin b'Chamisha Asar generally read the Megillah on the 15th of Adar. In the times of the Nes of Purim, the city of Shushan had a war not only on the 13th of Adar, but also the next day, as Esther requested from Achashverosh on the 14th of Adar, and therefore they only rested from the enemy on the 15th of Adar, and that was their Purim. The other cities had Purim after they fought on the 13th of Adar, rested and celebrated Purim on the 14th of Adar. Now, even though Shushan was not walled from the time of Yoshua ben Nun, and it has the special din, in order to give respect for the walled cities in Yerushalayim that at the time of Shushan, at the time of Nes of Purim, were already destroyed, Chazal backed up the timing for when it has to be a unique city, a special fortified walled city, back to the time of Yoshua ben Nun, such that Yerushalayim and other walled cities in Eretz Yisrael would have the special, unique day of Purim like that of Shushan. And that's why it depends on if they were walled at the time that Yoshua ben Nun came in to capture Eretz Yisrael. And generally speaking, the Mishnah says, Kifarim, small villages, Va'ayaros Gedolos, and large cities, but are not surrounded by a wall from the time of Yoshua ben Nun. Korin Ba'arba, so read on the 14th of Adar, as do most cities to this day. Ella, however, meaning how do we get to be the 11th, 12th, or 13th of Adar? She'akifarim makdimim, the villages sometimes will read the Megillah earlier, as many as 3 days earlier, as we'll see in the next Mishnah, liyom hakenisa, to the day they come into the larger cities. On Mondays and Thursdays, the villagers would come into the larger cities to adjudicate, to go to Besdin, to judge their Dinei Torah, and they used to have markets on those days as a result of Mondays and Thursdays. And therefore the rule is that small villages, and we'll see in Mishnah Gimel what constitutes a small village, would read the Megillah always on a Monday or a Thursday. And therefore the Mishnah, the next Mishnah, goes through the permutations of what happens when the 14th of Adar falls on every day of the week. So the starting point is always going to be what happens if the 14th of Adar falls on Ketzad. If the 14th of Adar falls on a Monday, so then it's Monday and the 14th. So Kifarim, the small villages, don't need to move anywhere. They read it that day. Va'ayaros Gedolos, and the large cities which are unwalled from the time of Yoshua ben Nun, not walled, Korim Yom, read on the 14th on Monday, Umukavas Chama L'macha, and the walled cities read tomorrow on Tuesday the 15th. Cholios Bashlishi El Baravi, if the 14th of Adar falls out on Tuesday or Wednesday, then Kifarim, the villagers, Makdim Aliyah Maknisa, read it earlier on Monday when they come into the larger cities. And therefore, if the 14th is Tuesday, they'll read it on the 13th. If the 14th is Wednesday, they'll be reading it on Monday, the 12th. Va'ayaros Gedolos, the large unwalled cities, Korim Yom, read it that day, Tuesday or Wednesday. Umukapas Choma, and the walled cities, Lamacha, read it the next day. In other words, on the 15th, be it Wednesday or be it Thursday. Cholios B'Chamishi, if the 14th of Adar falls out on Thursday, once again, it's like Monday. Kifarim Va'ayaros Gedolos, the villagers and the large unwalled cities, Korim Yom, read that day on Thursday. Umukapas Choma, and the walled cities, Lamacha, read it tomorrow on Friday. Cholios Erev Shabbos, if 14th of Purim falls out on Erev Shabbos, so here, like this, we do not read the Megillah on Shabbos, and therefore it's going to produce a problem to the walled cities. So Kifarim, the villagers, Makdim Aliyah Maknisa, read it yesterday on Thursday, on the day they came in, which will be the 13th. Va'ayaros Gedolos, the large cities, are going to be reading it on Friday. Umukavas Choma, and also the walled cities, Korim Yom, read it on Friday. In other words, in this case, the walled cities get moved up earlier a day to the 14th, because under no circumstances do you get pushed past the 15th, like the Mishnah said in its introduction to the first Mishnah. Cholios b'Shabbos, if the 14th occurs on Shabbos, so then we have to move the villagers and the large unwalled cities. Once we're moving the large unwalled cities, we move everybody to Thursday. Kfarim, the villagers, V'ayoros Gedolos, in the large unwalled cities, Makdimim, they have to read earlier, and once they have to read earlier, they read it together, B'korim Liyom HaKnisa, they read it the day the villagers come in on Thursday. So everybody reads it on the 13th, except the walled cities. Umukapas Choma, the walled cities, L'mocha, read it on Sunday, which is the 15th. Cholios Achar HaShabbos, if Purim if the 14th of Adar occurs on Sunday. Kefarim, the villagers, Makdim Liyom HaKnisa, read it on the previous Thursday, and that would mean that they read it on the 11th of Adar. We don't push them forward to Monday because we want to leave the walled cities whenever possible to have their unique day of Purim, and therefore they read the villagers earlier on the 11th, which is Thursday. Va'yoros Gedolos, the large cities unwalled, Korim B'Yom, read it on Sunday the 14th. Umukafas Chom, and the walled cities L'machar, read it tomorrow on the 15th. So in general, the walled cities always read the Megillah on the 15th, unless the 15th is on Shabbos, then they read it on Friday, the 14th. When it comes to the unwalled cities, again, they always read it on the 14th, except when the 14th falls on Shabbos, they read it 2 days earlier on Thursday together with the villagers who are coming into their cities to read it anyway on the 12th. The villagers, if the 14th is Monday and Thursday, they read it then. If the 14th is not Monday and Thursday, they read it on the previous Monday or Thursday, which could be if the 14th is Tuesday on the 13th, if the 14th is Wednesday on the 12th, and if the 14th is Sunday, that would mean that they read it on the 11th. The Mishnah now goes on to discuss what is considered to be a village and what is considered to be a large unwalled city. In other words, who has the halacha that they have to read it, generally speaking, on the 14th unless it comes out on Shabbos, and who are these people that are allowed to read it earlier? Now, the reason why the people in the villages were allowed to read it earlier is because typically they did not have their own Baal Koreh who would be proficient at the reading, and therefore they had to come into the large cities and find somebody to read for them. So the Mishnah says, Ezohi or Gedola, what's considered to be a large city, and they have to read on their own on the 14th, again, unless it comes out on Shabbos. Kol sheyesh ba, any city that has Asara Batlonim. Batlonim means people that don't do any work, that sit in the Beis Medrash all day. In other words, they have a ready kollel or minyan in the city. They have to always read it on the 14th. Pachos mikan, if they don't have less than 10 people set aside to be learning all day, even if they have many people in the city, harei ze kfar, that's a village, and they are allowed to read earlier on the Yom HaKnisa. Says the Mishnah, Be'elu Amru, with these they said, in other words, with the times of Megillah reading, both for the walled cities, if it falls out on 15th, falls out on Shabbos, as well as for the unwalled city, if the 14th falls out on Shabbos. So we said that if it falls out on Shabbos, Makdimin, you make it earlier. They read on Friday for the walled cities, Thursday for the unwalled cities. Veloma Achron, we don't delay it past. We don't go past the 15th. But certain things, if you can't do them on Shabbos, as we'll see, then you do them later and not earlier. When it comes to the reading of Megillah, the Megillah says, V'lo ya'avar, do not allow the days, either the 14th or the 15th, to pass without reading Megillah. And therefore, if you can't read it on that day, you make it earlier. Says the Mishnah, Aval Zeman Atzei Kohanim. As we learned in Maseches Tanis, there were 9 days designated during the year that people, families, along with certain Kohanim, would dedicate wood to the Beis HaMikdash. Aval Zeman Atzei Kohanim, but the times of the wood, the donation of the wood along with the Kohanim. V'Tisha B'Av, if the fast of Tisha B'Av occurs on Shabbos, and for that matter any other rabbinic fast except Yom Kippur, V'Chagiga, and bringing the Chagiga offering, which was a Karban Shlamim, that every Jew who came Aliyah L'Regel 3 times a year had to bring on the first day of Yom Tov. Now, although you could bring this Karban Shlamim, the Chagiga, on Yom Tov, if the first day of Yom Tov falls out on Shabbos, it was not brought, because although it pushes off Yom Tov, it doesn't push off Shabbos. So if it occurs that Shabbos is the first day of Yom Tov, the Hakel is once every 7th year, which is after the year of the Shemitah, the first year in the new cycle, the night after the first night of Sukkot. In other words, the first night of Chol HaMoed, there was a mitzvah of Hakel. If that night should occur on Matzah Shabbos, on Friday night, in other words, if Yom Tov, the first day of Sukkot, was on Friday, which does not happen in our calendar, but could happen when they relied on witnesses to testify on the new moon, like we learned in Rosh Hashanah. So it should occur that the first night of Chol HaMoed Sukkah should come out on Friday night. We don't do Hakel on that night either, because since there's a mitzvah to bring the children along, you can't carry them. And therefore, Ma'achrim, we delay it to Sunday. We delay the wood dedication to Sunday. We delay the fast of Tisha B'Av to Sunday. We delay the bringing of the Chagiga to Sunday. And Hakel also, Ma'acharin, we delay below Makdimin, and we don't make it earlier. Parenthetically, this is true by all fast days except Tanis Esther, as we know, because since Tanis Esther is done to commemorate the days before Purim, since the reading of the Megillah has to be pushed back earlier, so Tanis Esther is pushed back earlier as well. And therefore, on our calendar, if Purim falls out on Shabbos, we fast Tanis Esther. We fast Tanis Esther on Thursday, and then we have the Mikra Megillah being on Friday. Or, again, if it's the walled cities, they'll still be able to do it on Sunday, but still the Tanis Esther will be on Thursday. Says the Mishnah, Afal Pi She'amru, Makdim Min V'lo Ma'achrin, even though we said that if the 14th or 15th comes out on Shabbos, we read the Megillah earlier and we don't delay it. Nevertheless, even though we learned, like we learned in the Seches Tanis, that the days of Megillah's Tanis, which include Chanukah, which include Purim, you're not allowed to fast, and you're not allowed to eulogize on them. That's only on the 14th and the 15th of Adar that you're not allowed to fast or eulogize. But if you happen to read the Megillah on the 13th on the Adar, or the 12th of Adar, or the 11th of Adar, Mutarim Behesped Ubitanis, you're allowed to, on the day of the reading of the Megillah, if it is the 11th, 12th, the 13th, or Adar, you're allowed to eulogize, Ubitanios, and you're allowed to fast. Even though the gifts to the poor, which is one of the other mitzvahs of Purim, should be done on the same day, on the proper day, the 14th or the 15th, if it was done at the same day as the reading of the Megillah, since the poor used to come to join the reading of the Megillah, you can fulfill the mitzvah on that day, on the 11th, 12th, or 13th. Along comes Rabbi Yehuda, and Rabbi Yehuda explains that this law about the small villages reading Megillah on 11th, 12th, and 13th is only in a situation where, in fact, they did not have their own minyan, and they used to come on Mondays and Thursdays to the larger cities. But what happens if they don't come in on Mondays and Thursdays to the larger cities? And therefore, they're like any other city, and therefore they'll have to read the Megillah always on the 14th. Amar Rabbi Yehuda Amosai, when is the halacha that the villagers could go ahead and read the Megillah on the 13th, 11th, 12th, or 13th? Mekom shenichnasim b'sheni u'b'chamishi, in a situation where they come into the larger cities on Mondays and Thursdays. Aval makom she'ein nichnasim lo b'sheni v'lo b'chamishi, but in a situation that they don't come into the larger cities on Mondays and Thursdays, and therefore the issue is only them finding a person who's proficient at reading the Megillah on the proper day, ein koren osoh ela bizmano, they're not allowed to read it but on its proper time. In the time of Bezin, as we learned, they did not necessarily have a calendar, so they did not know in the first Adar necessarily if there would be a leap year. Of course, sometimes they could have decided that ahead of Adar. Typically speaking, the reading of the Megillah and all the mitzvahs of Purim should be done in the second Adar. But it could come to be that they read the Megillah and did all the mitzvahs of Purim on the first month of Adar, and only then did Bezin decide to make it a leap year. Says the Mishnah, Karu with HaMegillah, if they read the Megillah and they did all the mitzvahs of Purim ba'Adar Harishon in the first Adar, Vinis Abra Hashan, and subsequently it was decided to make a leap year, Koren Osa ba'Adar Hasheni, you have to read it again in the second Adar. That is that the mitzvahs of Purim are associated with the second Adar. Says the Mishnah, Ein bein Adar Rishon la'Adar Sheni, there's no difference between the two Adars, Ela Kriyas HaMegillah Matanos Levyonim, only the mitzvos of the day of Purim, the reading of Megillah and the gifts to the poor, and for that matter, Mishloach Manos, sending food products each to their friend. The Mishnah is telling us, but with regard to the prohibition against fasting or eulogizing on the 14th or 15th of Adar, this is true about both Adar Rishon and Adar Sheni, for that matter, eating a Suda. And therefore, the halacha is that you have to, on the 14th and 15th of Adar Rishon, you have to also treat it as if it were somewhat of a Yom Tov, in that you cannot eulogize and you cannot fast on those days. Interestingly enough, we now at the end of Mishnah Dawid have completed for this chapter all the halachos that are going to be relevant to Mikra Megillah, and because we use the terminology ein bein, that is that we compared and contrasted the two things which are somewhat similar, the Mishnah from here until the end of the parak is going to do exactly the same thing with all kinds of things all over Shas. And therefore from here till the end of the parak, we're going to have things that are unrelated to the halachos of Megillah or Purim and are just things which are similar yet different. The Mishnah tells us, ein bein Yom Tov l'Shabbos, there's no difference between Yom Tov and Shabbos. Of course, that there are differences that we'll see, but in terms of the prohibition of doing work, ela ochel nefesh bilvad, only the work which is in the preparing of food alone. In other words, all the malachos which are prohibited on Shabbos are prohibited on Yom Tov, except those things which are in the preparation of food, which are permitted on Yom Tov, but prohibited on Shabbos. Similarly, says the Mishnah, ein bein Shabbos v'Yom HaKippurim, there's no difference between Shabbos and Yom Kippur, and here all work is forbidden on Yom Kippur, like it is on Shabbos. The difference between Shabbos and Yom Kippur is in the punishment. Ela, rather, shezeh, meaning only difference is, shezeh, that when it comes to Shabbos, zidono, if one on purpose, with witnesses, violates Shabbos with malacha, bidei adam, is punished by the hands of man, by the court, with skila. V'zeh, whereas on Yom Kippur, so don't know if you went ahead and on purpose did one of the prohibited malachos on Yom Kippur, for that matter, ate on Yom Kippur, b'kares, you get punished by kares. Of course, another difference between Shabbos and Yom Kippur is the prohibition of eating on Yom Kippur, which does not apply on Shabbos. But the Mishnah is focused on the prohibited aspects of work. All the prohibitions of work are the same on Shabbos and Yom Kippur, only the punishment is different. As a side note, the punishment for doing work on Yom Tov is malchus, is lashes. So Yom Kippur is more stringent than Yom Tov, and Shabbos is more stringent than Yom Kippur. Interesting to note, the Gemara deals with it that the Mishnah could have said that another difference between Shabbos and Yom Tov is in the punishment as well. Mishnah Vav continues to discuss differences, and here we're going to discuss the halachos of a neder if a person makes an oath. Ein Bain, says the Mishnah, there's no difference, hamudar hanoah mechaveru, to a person who made a neder, prohibiting his friend to derive any benefit from him, lamudar mimenu ma'achol, to a person who made an oath prohibiting that his friend derive food benefit from him. Now, if you make a neder against deriving food benefit, you're not allowed to borrow from the person that you're not allowed to derive benefit from. You're not allowed to borrow a pot. Since the pot will cook food, it will ultimately derive food benefit. Says the Mishnah, what difference is it if you made an oath against deriving any benefit or food benefit? Ella, there's two differences. Derisas haregel, trespassing, stepping of the foot. A person who forbids himself to derive any benefit from his friend can't even pass through his property. Somebody who only made an oath not to derive food benefit can trespass through his property. The kelim shein osem bahem ochel nefesh, and vessels with which you are not preparing food. In other words, vessels that you are using not to prepare food cannot be used by a person who prohibited any type of hana from his friend, but a person who went ahead and made an oath only not to derive a food benefit can use vessels that aren't being used for the purposes of food. Parenthetically, if it's customary in that place to pay for the renting of vessels and he's allowing him to use it for free, then the Gemara says you're not allowed to use it even if you made a non-food, just a food oath, because since ultimately the money you save by not paying the rental you could use to buy food, that would be considered to be a potential food benefit. The Mishnah talks about one other difference about oaths. There are two types of ways that a person could obligate himself to be chayav a korban. One is where a person designates a specific animal. He pledged a certain animal as a korban, and then if for whatever reason that animal got lost or stolen, he no longer is obligated because the animal he pledged is the only one he pledged and it's not around. Or if he pledged that he would bring a certain type of korban, in which case even if he subsequently separates an animal, if that animal got lost or stolen, he still hasn't fulfilled his obligation since the obligation was upon him. Says the Mishnah, Ein bein nedarim u'nedavos. There's no difference between a neder, where a person said it is incumbent upon me to bring a korban, l'nedavos, to a pledge, where a person said this animal should be a korban. When a person makes a neder, he ultimately designates the certain animal to fulfill the neder. But the point is, initially, he made the obligation on himself. Ela shehanidarim, if you made a neder initially upon yourself, chayav be'achrayusan, you're chayav in their responsibility. If they got lost or stolen, you have to replace them. Unedavos, if you initially had pledged only a certain animal be a korban, then the halacha is if it's stolen or lost, eino chayav be'achrayusan, you're not obligated to repay it if it ultimately got lost. Mishnah Zayin goes on to discuss another halacha, the halacha of a zav, a male person who has a gonorrheal discharge. Here the Torah tells us that there are essentially three levels of tumah. If he has one gonorrheal discharge, he's tameh only for that day. Goes to the mikvah during the day, and at night, he's tahor. Should he have two gonorrheal discharges, either on the same day or one on each of two successive days, the halacha is that he's tameh for 7 complete days. He needs to have 7 days without a gonorrheal discharge, and after that, he immerses himself into the mikvah. If he has 3 gonorrheal discharges, either on one day or on 2 days, one on one day, 2 on the other day, or one on each of 3 successive days, again, he's tameh for 7 days. He has to be clean, no discharge for 7 days. But here, besides going to the mikvah at the end of the 7 days, on day 8, he has to bring 2 birds for a korban, one a chatas and one an olah. Says the Mishnah, again, we're talking about male tum'as zav. Do not confuse this with female tum'as ziva. Ein bein zav haroeh shtei re'iyos. There's no difference between a zav who had 2 discharges, who saw 2 sightings of the discharge, whether in 1 day or in 2 days. Lo ro'eh shalosh, to a zav who had 3 sightings on the same day, on 2 days, or on 3 days. Ella korban. They're both tameh for 7 days. The difference is, do they have to bring the korban on day 8? The one who had 2 discharges, no. The one who had 3 discharges, yes. We move on in the halachos of tumah. The Torah tells us that there are various types of tsaras, which is poorly translated as leprosy. And the halacha is that when a person comes initially to the Kohen, there are certain circumstances under which the Kohen could declare him immediately as Tameh, and that is known as a mitzorah muchlat, a confirmed mitzorah. And there are certain situations that the mitzorah is confined. He's locked up for a week or 2 weeks in order to determine if the tsaras will spread or develop a siman tumah. This is known as a mitzorah muskar, a confined mitzorah. So the Mishnah says, Ein bei mitzorah muskar, there's no difference between a mitzorah who has been confined, a mitzorah muchlat, to a mitzorah who has been confirmed, ella peria, only letting of the hair grow, uperima, and tearing the garments. That is, a mitzorah who has been confirmed as a mitzorah has to let his hair grow as long as he's a mitzorah, and a mitzorah who's been confirmed as a mitzorah has to tear his clothing. Whereas a mitzorah who is only confirmed as a mitzorah doesn't have to do either of the, who only confined as a mitzorah does not have to do these things until he's declared tameh. The point of the Mishnah is that with regard to their tumah, during their state of being either confirmed or confined, they both have the same halachos of tumah during that period of time. Of course, a mitzorah who's never confirmed as a mitzorah can go through his tahara process sooner. But nevertheless, during that time, whether he's a muskor or a muchlat, the way in which he's metameh, as is elucidated in Maseches Negoim, is the same. Says the Mishnah, Ein vein tahar mitoch esker. There's no difference between a person who is tahar from a state of having been only confined as a mitzorah. In other words, during that week or 2 weeks, the tsaras didn't spread, or it got smaller, and therefore he was declared as tahar. Now, says the Mishnah, he needs to go and immerse himself in the mikvah. So there's no difference between a person who became tahar from a state of being confined, l'tahar mitoch echad, to a mitzorah who becomes tahar after having been confirmed as a mitzorah, meaning they have to go through the same process, that is, that they have to have 7 days in which they have to go through a tahara process. Says the Mishnah, Ela tiglachas v'tziporim. The difference between the two is the tiglachas, the shaving of the head, as we'll see, v'tziporim, and the bringing of the korban. That is, a mitzorah who was confirmed as a mitzorah has to go ahead and bring, after 7 days, 7 clean days after he finished, after his tsaras went away, he has to shave his head, and he has to bring 2 birds, one of which is a korban, and one of which is involved in the purification process. But a person who was only confined as a mitzorah, so the halacha is that only he has to immerse himself and his clothing in a mikvah, but he does not have to bring a korban or shave his head. But the Mishnah means to say they have the same halacha with regard to their self-tahara process and with regard to the process of the tahara of their begadim. The Mishnah now goes on to discuss halachos of writing kisvei HaKodesh, of writing holy documents. And the Mishnah says, Ein bein sfarim l'tfilin u'mezuzos. There's no difference between sfarim. Sfarim in the Mishnah means the writing of Torah, Nevi'im, or Ksuvim, to the writing of the parshios, the parchments that go inside the tefillin or inside the mezuzah. Ella, the difference being between them, in other words, all of them require that you write them with Shema for the intention of fulfilling the mitzvah, for the kedusha of the Sefer Torah, for the tefillin of the mezuzahs. What difference is there? She'asefarim, the Sefer Torah, Nevi'im and Ksuvim, Nichtavim b'chol lashon, can even be written in other languages, in languages which are translations. Utefillin and mezuzahs, whereas tefillin and mezuzahs, einon nichtavos, are only allowed to be written ela ashuris. They have to be written in the Lashon HaKodesh and in the special script of Lashon HaKodesh. But a Sefer Torah could even be written in any other language. The Gemara explains that this was due to an episode in which the Septuagint, the Greek ruler, it actually took place in Egypt, but the Greek ruler made them translate the Torah into 70 lashonos and into 70 languages, and as a result, according to the Tanna Kama, it can subsequently be written in any language. Rav Shimon ben Gamliel says it can't be written in any language. Af b'sfarim, even when it comes to svarim, you can't write it in any language. Lo hitiru, they did not allow sheyikasvu, that it be written in another language. Ela yavanis, only in Greek. Greek is the only other language. So according to the Tanna Kama, Sefer Torah, Nevi'im, and Ksuvim can be written in any of the 70 languages, whereas according to Rav Shimon ben Gamliel, even a Sefer Torah can only be written in Greek besides Lashon HaKodesh. Tefillin and mezuzahs, only in Lashon HaKodesh. The Mishnah now goes and contrasts 2 types of Kohen Gadol. The Kohen Gadol, the Torah tells us, wears 8 garments. He has the 4 garments of the regular Kohen, which include shirt, pants, a belt, and a hat. And he has the additional 4 garments that he wears, the tzitz, the headbands, and he wears the me'il, the long tchelas, blue wool cloak over his shirt and pants. And he also has the choshen and the ephod, the breastplate, and the and the waistband that he wears around to hold up the breastplate. These are the four unique garments of the Kohen Gadol, in addition to the four regular garments. In addition, the Kohen Gadol is supposed to be anointed with Shemen HaMishcha, with anointing oil. The Shemen HaMishcha was available until towards the end of the first Beis HaMikdash, after which King Yoshio, towards the end of the first Beis HaMikdash, hid it. Nonetheless, the Kohen Gadol can become Kohen Gadol simply by wearing the additional 8 garments, the additional 4 garments, totaling 8, and doing the service in the Beis HaMikdash. What are the halachos, if there are any differences between the Kohen Gadol who is wearing the 8 garments and has been anointed with the anointing oil, as opposed to the Kohen Gadol who was not? Ein bein Kohen Mashuach b'Shemen HaMishcha. There's no difference between the Kohen who was anointed with the anointing oil, L'meruva begadim, to a Kohen Gadol who simply is becoming Kohen Gadol by wearing additional garments. There's one difference between him. Ela par haba'al kol mitzvos. The ox that comes for all mitzvos. The Torah tells us in Parshas Vayikra that when it comes to a Kohen Gadol, under certain circumstances, which we will learn in Maseches Horios, but basically where the Kohen Gadol made an error in Psak Halacha, and he allowed something which was a chiyuv kares, and he went ahead and he did it. He allowed a certain type of fat, chelev, or a certain type of service to Avodah Zarah, and he went ahead and he did it. So the halacha is that he has to bring a special bull as a korban chatos. The blood even is sprinkled inside the heichal. The chatos is not eaten, it's totally burnt, known as the par kohen Mashiach. If a regular person does such an avera, he only brings a regular korban chatos, which is a female sheep or goat. So the Kohen Gadol has a special korban chatos under unique circumstances. That the Torah calls him the Kohen HaMashiach, the anointed Kohen Gadol. So only a Kohen Gadol who was anointed with the anointing oil brings that form of a korban chatos, whereas a Kohen Gadol who simply became Kohen Gadol by wearing the additional garments, in terms of a korban chatos, he's like a regular person, and he brings a regular korban chatos, not that special korban chatos. Similarly, the Mishnah tells us that we learned, for example, in Maseches Yuma, that the Kohen Gadol had a replacement Kohen Gadol who could take over for a part of the time if the Kohen Gadol became tameh, if the Kohen Gadol became temporarily blemished. Says the Mishnah, Ein ben Kohen meshamish. There's no difference between the acting Kohen Gadol, the Kohen she'avar, to the Kohen Gadol who passed, in other words, who used to be the Kohen Gadol, Ela par Yom HaKippurim, the ox of the Kohen Gadol on Yom Kippur, like we learned in Maseches Yuma, that's the bull, the ox, whose blood goes all the way into the Kodesh HaKadoshim and the fats on the Mizbeach. The rest of the ox is totally burnt outside of Yerushalayim. That is only brought by the acting Kohen Gadol. V'asiris ha'efa, the 10th of an ephah, which is the measurement of the minchas chavitim, the daily flour offering that was brought by the Kohen Gadol, half offered in the morning with the Tamid Shel Shachar, half offered in the afternoon with the Tamid Shel Ben Harabayim, as we learned in the Seches Yuma. That was only brought by the acting Kohen Gadol. However, with regard to all the other halachos, the ability to do the avoda in 8 garments, as well as the prohibitions that are associated with the Kohen Gadol, not to become ritually impure, even to relatives that died, whereas a regular Kohen can, and the prohibition against, among other women that a Kohen can't marry, not to marry a widow as well, that applies also to a Kohen Gadol who has passed, even if he is not the currently acting Kohen Gadol. Until the time that there was a Mishkan in the Midbar, everybody was allowed to build their own Mizbeach wherever they wanted and bring a korban, like we find Noach explicitly in the Torah brought a korban, and Avraham Avinu also we find in the Torah built a Mizbeach. Once there was a Mizbeach in the Mishkan, and importantly there was an Aron in the Mishkan, you no longer were allowed to offer personal karbanos, and everything needed to be brought into the Mishkan. When Klal Yisrael went into Eretz Yisrael, although there was a Mizbeach which was built in Gilgal, nevertheless the Aron was not present there in the Mishkan, because it traveled with them in the wars that they had. And therefore, during that time, the halacha was that there was such a thing as the public Bama, the public Mizbeach in Gilgal, and you were still allowed to, as we'll see in the Mishnah, allow karbanos to bring karbanos on private bamos as well. This was known as a bamas yachid, an individual mizbeach. When the Mishkan was built in Shiloh, after the wars were over, it was there for 369 years, and the Aron was there in Shiloh as well. Once again, it became prohibited to bring karbanos anywhere but in Mishkan Shiloh. Once Shiloh was destroyed, and the 52 years that the Mishkan was then in Nov and Givon, but the Aron was taken out of Shiloh and it was stolen. So the halacha is that again during that time it was permitted to bring individual karbanos. There was the Bama Gedola, the large Bama in Nov and in Givon, and it was permitted to bring individual karbanos as well. Once the Beis HaMikdash was built in Yerushalayim, it became prohibited again to bring karbanos on your own Mizbeach, and that prohibition remains to this day. So once the Beis HaMikdash was built in Yerushalayim, personal sacrifices on Mizbeach personally became prohibited forever, even after the destruction of Yerushalayim. So again, the way to remember it, until Yerushalayim, when the Aron was in the Mishkan, the halacha is during that period of time, which is in the Midbar and in Shiloh, there were no personal karbanos on a Mizbeach on your own Mizbeach at all. When the Aron was not in the Mishkan, during the 14 years that the Klal Yisrael divided up Eretz Yisrael and went to war in Gilgal, and during the 52 years after Nov and Givon, after Shiloh, there was both a public bama in Nov, Givon, and Gilgal, and also private karbanos were allowed on the Mizbeach as well. So the Mishnah discusses which karbanos can be brought on which Mizbeach. Ein bein bama gedola lebama katana. There's no difference between the large bama, which is the Mizbeach in Gilgal and in Nov and Givon, to the bama katana, to the personal Mizbeach. At the time that you were allowed to make a personal Mizbeach, Ela Pesachim. The halacha is that although you could bring any regular individual korban in your own backyard if you wanted during that time, but the korban Pesach had to be go ahead and brought on the Bama Gedola in Nov and Givon and Gilgal. In other words, karbanos that were personal but had a set time, on the 14th of Nisan, you had to travel to Gilgal, to Nov and Givon, to go ahead and to bring them back. Ze'aklal. Here is the rule. Kol shehu nidar v'nidav, anything which could be offered either as a pledge of a certain animal, or an obligation of yourself. In other words, a korban ola or shlamim, which can be brought voluntarily. Karev v'bama can be brought in a personal mizbeach. V'chol she'eino nidar v'lo nidav, but something which cannot be offered as a personal karb, as a voluntary karban. In other words, if it's not a voluntary korban like an ola or shlamim, but it's an obligatory korban that has a set time like a Pesach, Eino karev b'bama, cannot be brought in a personal bama. You would have to go ahead and bring that in the large bama. And so obligatory karbanos that did not have a set time could have been brought by the individual even in his own personal bama at the time that those bamas were permitted. But that which have a set time like a korban Pesach could only be brought in the public bama in Nov, Givon, or in Gilgal. It's interesting to note as well that the daily public karbanos as well, like the Talmud and so on and so forth, the daily ones that had a time were also only brought in the public bama in Nov and Givon and in Gilgal during that first 14 years in Gilgal and then 52 years in Nov and Givon, all had only public, the Talmud in that location. And the Gemara says that the public karbanos that don't have a set time, in other words, the ones that are dependent on the public, let's say doing an Avera, the Par Helam Davar Shal Tzibor, if Bezdin erroneously ruled and people had to bring a certain korban, that was not brought at all at the time that there was a bama. You needed a Beis HaMikdash, or you needed a Mishkan and Shiloh with a permanent Mizbeach and the Aron there in order to bring these karbanos. Have a wonderful day. The Mishnah tells us the differences between the Kedusha of the Mishkan and Shiloh and the Kedusha of the Beis HaMikdash. Ein ben Shiloh Yerushalayim, there is little difference between Shiloh and Yerushalayim. Ela shebeshiloh, when the Mishkan was in Shiloh, Ochlin Kachim Kalim, you were able to eat Kachim Kalim, that is a korban Shlamim, Toda, Bechor, Maser, and Pesach, Ma'aser Sheni, and you can eat Ma'aser Sheni, that you have to bring the produce to Yerushalayim, or to the Makom HaMishkan in the case of Shiloh, or redeem it and bring the money. In Shiloh, when the Mishkan was in Shiloh, you could eat these things from any place that you can see Shiloh from. It didn't have to be within the border of the city of Shiloh. Ubi Yerushalayim, but when the Beis HaMikdash was in Yerushalayim, Lifnim and Achoma, you had to eat these things inside the walls of Yerushalayim, so you had to physically be located in the city. V'kan. However, in both places in Shiloh and in Yerushalayim, Kodesh Kodashim, higher level karbanos, Chatos, Asham, and the like, Ne'echolim lifnim and akoim had to be eaten inside the curtains of the walls. In the Mishkan Shiloh, it was curtains in the Mishkan. In the Beis HaMikdash, it was the walls of the Azara that you have to eat the kachim kalim inside. The Mishnah concludes, as we mentioned in the previous Mishnah, Kedushas Shiloh, the sanctity of Shiloh that prohibited personal mizbechos, yesh acharei hater. There was permissibility to have a personal mizbeach after the destruction of Shiloh. Once, however, Yerushalayim, the Beis HaMikdash was built, to Kedushas Yerushalayim ein acharei hater. The sanctity of Yerushalayim does not have a heter afterward. Once Yerushalayim was built, there's no permissibility to have a bama even after the destruction of Yerushalayim. Shiloh, in that sense, Kedusha was not permanent, but in Yerushalayim, the Kedusha was permanent.